The snow came down in the dark, like the world was turning to ash. It wasn't a gentle snow. It was a mean, biting snow, the kind that reminded you that the world didn't care if you lived or died. Out on the ridge, Harlan Wade's cabin was just a smudge of light against the blackness, a fortress of logs built to keep the world out. And Harlan Wade liked it that way. The wind howled, rattling the shutters, a sound he knew better than any human voice. Then came a sound he didn't know. A tiny tapping, tap, tap. It was so faint he thought it was a branch or a bird confused by the storm. He was a man who had gotten used to silence. He had chosen it, fought for it. The fire crackled in the hearth, his only company for 10 long years. Tap, tap. There it was again, sharper this time, insistent. Harlan rose from his chair. The movement was slow, stiff, like an old bear waking from a long sleep. His shadow stretched up the wall, huge and menacing, a monster made of darkness. He didn't get visitors. Ever. Anyone who knew him knew better than to climb this ridge, especially in a storm. He grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace, the weight of it familiar in his hand. He pulled the heavy door inward. A blast of wind and snow rushed in, and with it 2 little figures, so small they barely reached his waist. They were ghosts made of snow and fear. The older one, maybe 7, stood straight, her chin up, but her tiny body was trembling so hard you could see it. The younger one, barely more than a toddler, hid behind her sister's ragged coat, clutching a fistful of wet wool. Their feet were bare, blue and purple against the white snow. They stared up at him, up at the mountain of a man with the jagged scar that cut a cruel line from his temple down his jaw. The lantern light caught the scar, made it look like a fresh wound. Harlan just stood there, the poker in his hand, blocking the warmth of the fire. The sight of them did something strange to him, freezing him solid. "Please, mister," the older one said. Her voice was a tiny thread against the roar of the wind. "We just need a place to get warm. We'll be gone by morning." Harlan's mind screamed at him to slam the door. Trouble. This was trouble wearing the faces of children. He knew where they came from. He'd heard the whispers in town. Virgil Cross, their stepfather. A man who measured kindness in crumbs and dealt out misery like it was his right. These were his cast-offs. He looked down at their feet, at the toes that were already blackening with frostbite. Something inside him, something he thought had died long ago, broke. He didn't say a word. He just stepped back, a single heavy step. It wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't a rejection either. They scrambled inside so fast they were just a blur of motion. They didn't look at him as they passed, just scurried toward the fire like 2 little mice. The older girl, her face grim with a responsibility no child should have, knelt and started rubbing her sister's frozen feet. Harlan shut the door, plunging the room back into a heavy silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howling of the wind. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't wanted anything. But now he had it. And he had a terrible feeling that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had just walked through his door. The cabin was one room, stripped bare of anything soft. A bed built into the wall, a stove, a table. It was the home of a man who needed nothing and wanted less. Harlan took a hunk of bread from a tin box and slammed it on the table. He filled 2 mugs with water from a bucket. His hands, huge and calloused, felt clumsy, like he'd forgotten how to do simple things. The girls watched him, their eyes wide. They didn't move from the fire until he grunted and nodded toward the table. They ate like starving animals, but with a strange, practiced politeness, tearing off small bites, chewing slowly, as if they were afraid the food would vanish if they looked at it too hard. Harlan sat across from them, arms crossed over his massive chest. He was a jailer watching his prisoners. "What's your names?" he asked. The words felt like stones in his mouth. "I'm Nora Jane," the older one said, her back straight. "This is Elsie May." Elsie May looked at him and gave a tiny, shy smile that almost broke his heart. He looked away, back at the fire. "My step-paw," Elsie May whispered, her mouth full of bread. "He said we were burdens." Nora Jane shot her a look, a sharp, silent warning. But the word was out. Burdens. It hung in the air, uglier than any curse. Harlan had heard that word before. He had felt it. "He said we didn't deserve the air we breathe," Elsie May went on, her voice getting smaller. Harlan's jaw tightened, the scar pulsed. He knew men like Virgil Cross, men who used their strength to crush things smaller than themselves. He stood up abruptly, making the girls jump. He threw another log on the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He needed to watch something burn. "You're warm here," he muttered, his back to them. "You're safe." He didn't know why he said it. It was a promise he had no intention of keeping. Later, he gave them his bed. He took the thin blanket from his cot and laid it over them. They curled together, two small knots in the center of the big, empty bed. He sat by the fire, planning to wait until they slept, but their whispers carried in the quiet room. "Do you think he's a monster, Nora?" Elsie May asked. "He's big," Nora Jane answered, "but monsters don't give you bread." A long silence, then Elsie May's voice, barely audible. "Did you bring it?" Nora Jane didn't answer right away. Harlan leaned forward, straining to hear. "I have it," Nora Jane finally whispered. "It's safe. He won't find it here." Harlan froze. Bring what? What were they hiding? These weren't just two starving children running from a cruel stepfather. They were carrying a secret, and they had brought that secret into his house. Morning came, grey and cold. Harlan had been awake all night, sitting by the dying fire, the girls' whispers echoing in his head. "I have it. It's safe." He watched them sleep. They looked so innocent, so fragile. But innocence was a lie. He knew that better than anyone. When they woke, he had porridge ready, hot and thick. He slid the bowls onto the table without a word. Elsie May ate greedily, but Nora Jane was different this morning. She was watchful. Her eyes followed his every move, sharp and intelligent. She was guarding her sister, and she was guarding their secret. "This is good porridge," Elsie said, her face smeared with it. "Stepor only gave us cold gruel. Said hot food was for people who worked." "And you didn't work?" Harlan asked, his voice flat. "We worked," Nora Jane said quietly, not looking at him. "We scrubbed the floors. We mended his clothes. We hauled water." She looked up then, and her eyes were not the eyes of a 7-year-old. They were old and weary. It was never enough. Harlan looked at her small, chapped hands. He had a sudden, violent urge to find Virgil Cross and break him in two. He crushed the feeling down. It was not his fight. He spent the day chopping wood. The rhythmic crack of the axe was the only thing that could quiet his mind. He could feel the girls watching him from the cabin window, two pairs of eyes judging him. He tried to ignore them. He was a rock, a mountain. Nothing could touch him. But when he came inside that evening, stamping the snow from his boots, he saw something that stopped him cold. On the rough wooden mantelpiece, next to his rusty lantern and his worn Bible, sat a small carved wooden bird. It was old, the paint faded, but it had been made with care. He hadn't seen it in 10 years. He had carved it himself, for his own daughter. The daughter he had lost. He turned to the girls. They were sitting at the table, pretending to be interested in the patterns of the wood grain. Elsie May wouldn't meet his eyes. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. His voice was a dangerous rumble. The girls flinched. "We found it," Nora Jane whispered, "in the corner, behind the woodpile." He had hidden it there the day after the fire, the day he had buried his wife and child, the day he had shut the world out for good. He snatched the bird from the mantelpiece, his hand crushing the delicate wood. "You don't touch what's not yours," he snarled. He expected them to cry, to shrink away from him, but Nora Jane stood up, her small fists clenched at her sides. "You shouldn't hide it," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "It's beautiful." And then she said the words that shattered his world. "Our mama had one just like it. She said our grandpa carved it for her." Harlan stared at her. His blood ran cold. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. His wife, Sarah, had been an only child. But his sister, his younger sister, who had run away from home years before he'd even met Sarah. She had loved the birds he carved. He had made her a dozen of them. He looked at Nora Jane, at her defiant chin, at her eyes, which were the same deep blue as his own. These weren't just strays. These weren't just Virgil Cross's stepdaughters. They were his blood. They were his kin. And their mother, his long-lost sister, was dead. The knowledge hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back, leaning against the cold stone of the fireplace. His sister, dead, and these children, her children, were his nieces. He had lived on this ridge for a decade, wrapped in his own grief, while his sister had been somewhere out there, living a life he knew nothing about. A life that had ended and left these two small girls alone with a man like Virgil Cross. The wooden bird felt like it was burning his hand. "Your mother," he said, the words catching in his throat. "What was her name?" "Lillian," Nora Jane said proudly. "Lillian Wade." Wade. She had kept their name. It all crashed down on him, the years of silence, the solitude he had cultivated like a rare, poisonous flower. It had all been a lie. He wasn't alone in the world. He looked at the girls, really looked at them, for the first time. He saw the shape of his own jaw in Nora Jane's face. He saw his mother's smile in Elsie May's. How could he not have seen it? "Virgil," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "he's not your father." "He married Mama after our real pa died," Nora Jane explained. "He was nice at first, but then Mama got sick, and after she passed, he changed. He started looking for things," Elsie May piped up. "He was always tearing up the floorboards, said Mama hid something from him." "Something that belonged to him," Nora Jane added, her eyes flashing. "But it didn't. It was hers. It was ours. I have it. It's safe. The secret. It wasn't just a trinket. It was an inheritance. Something Virgil Cross was willing to tear a house apart to find. Something he was willing to throw two children out into a blizzard for." Harlan's mind was racing. His sister wouldn't have married a man like that for love. It must have been for protection. For the girls. And she had hidden something from him. Something valuable. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was not over. Virgil Cross would be back. The storm had passed. The next day, the sky was a brittle, unforgiving blue. "We're going to town," Harlan announced. He needed supplies, but more than that, he needed answers. He hitched the old horse to the wagon. The girls, bundled in his old coats, sat on the bench beside him. They looked impossibly small. The town was nestled in the valley, a place Harlan avoided like the plague. He knew what they said about him. The monster of the ridge. The man with the devil's mark on his face. As they rode down the main street, the town went quiet. People stopped what they were doing and just stared. Windows became frames for disapproving faces. He felt Nora Jane's small hand slip into his. He looked down at her. She wasn't looking at the townspeople. She was looking at him, her expression a mixture of fear and trust. It was a feeling he hadn't known in a very, very long time. He pulled up in front of the mercantile. The storekeeper, a sour-faced man named Raleigh, watched them through the window. "Stay here," Harlan told the girls. He swung himself down from the wagon and walked into the store. The bell above the door jangled, announcing his presence. The handful of customers inside fell silent. "Need flour," Harlan said, his voice echoing in the stillness. "And lard. Salt." Raleigh moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes full of suspicion. "Heard you got company up on that ridge, Wade." "I do," Harlan said, meeting his gaze. "Some folks might say you ain't fit to have company," Raleigh muttered, weighing the flour. "Especially not children." Harlan's hands clenched into fists. He could feel the rage, hot and familiar, rising in his chest. But then the door opened again, and Reverend Amos Fletcher walked in. The preacher was a good man, but his eyes were filled with a weary sadness. "Harlan," he said, his voice gentle, "I was hoping I'd see you. We need to talk about those girls." "There's nothing to talk about," Harlan said. "Their stepfather, Virgil Cross, he was in town yesterday," the preacher continued, ignoring him. "He's filed a complaint with the sheriff. Says you kidnapped his stepdaughters." Harlan's blood ran cold. Kidnapped. The word was a trap, a cage. "He's lying," Harlan said through gritted teeth. "Perhaps," the preacher said, his eyes searching Harlan's face, "but he's their legal guardian. The law is on his side. Sheriff's planning on riding up to your place tomorrow." Harlan felt the walls of the store closing in. The faces of the other customers were a blur of condemnation. He had one day. One day to prove that those girls were better off with a monster than they were with the man the law protected. He paid for his supplies, his hands trembling with a rage he couldn't unleash. As he turned to leave, he saw a pair of small, sturdy boots lined with fleece. He pointed at them. "I'll take those." Raleigh smirked. Buying gifts now, are we? Harlan just stared at him until the man nervously wrapped the boots in brown paper. He walked out of the store and back to the wagon. He handed the package to Nora Jane. Her eyes went wide as she opened it. For us? Elsie May breathed. He just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. As they rode out of town, he felt the weight of every stare. They saw a kidnapper, a brute, a man who had no right to children. They didn't see the truth, not yet. But Harlan knew that the truth had a way of coming out, and it was usually accompanied by fire and blood. The ride back to the cabin was silent and tense. Harlan's mind was a storm, the preacher's words echoing like thunder. The law is on his side. The law didn't care about half a loaf of bread or bare feet in the snow. The law cared about papers and names, and Virgil Cross held all the cards. When they got back, the girl's joy over the new boots was a sharp, painful thing. Elsie May stomped around the cabin, laughing, while Nora Jane laced hers up with a solemn, careful precision. "We can run faster now," Nora Jane said quietly, more to herself than to him. Harlan's gut twisted. He wasn't just giving them warmth, he was preparing them for a fight. Or a flight. That night a new visitor came. The knock was soft, hesitant. Not like the tiny, desperate tapping of the girls or the angry rattling he expected from the sheriff. He opened the door to find Maggie Hayes standing there. She was a widow who lived on the next ridge over, a woman as quiet and solitary as himself. The town mostly left her alone too, but her eyes weren't filled with judgment. They were filled with a fierce, knowing light. She held a bundle wrapped in cloth. "I heard," she said, her voice low, "in town, what Virgil's saying." She stepped inside, her gaze taking in the two girls who were staring at her with wide, curious eyes. Her face softened. "I brought them something." She unwrapped the bundle on the table. Inside were two simple dresses, one blue, one a faded rose. They were clean and mended, an offering. "My own daughter outgrew them years ago," she said. The girls were speechless. They touched the soft fabric as if it were spun gold. Maggie looked at Harlan. "You've taken on a heavy load." "They're my blood," he said. The words still tasted strange on his tongue, but they were true. "They're my sister's girls." Maggie's eyebrows shot up. The surprise on her face was genuine. "Lillian? Lillian was your sister?" He nodded. Maggie sank into a chair, a look of profound sorrow on her face. "Oh, Harlan, I knew her. Not well. But I knew her. She came to me once, a few months before she passed. She was afraid." The air in the cabin grew thick. "Afraid of what?" Harlan pressed. "Of him. Of Virgil," Maggie said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "She told me he wasn't what he seemed. She said she'd made a terrible mistake. She was trying to find a way out, for her and the girls." Maggie looked at the girls, who were now shyly holding the dresses up against themselves. "She told me she had something," Maggie continued, "a protection for her girls, a legacy from her father. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should look for the birds." Harlan's head snapped up. "The birds?" "Yes," Maggie said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "She said, the birds will show the way." I never understood what she meant. Harlan's gaze shot to the wooden bird he had placed back on the mantel, the one his father had taught him to carve, the one his sister had cherished. It wasn't just a memory, it was a message. He grabbed the bird. It was light, carved from soft pine. He turned it over and over in his rough hands. There was nothing special about it, just a simple toy. Nora Jane walked over to him. "Mama had one too," she said again. "She kept it in her sewing box." "Her sewing box?" Harlan asked. "Virgil smashed it," Elsie May said, her lip trembling. "He was looking for his papers." "It wasn't his," Nora Jane insisted, her small face a mask of fury. "It was Mama's land." Land, of course. It was always about land. Harlan looked at the bird again. He ran his thumb along the base, and then he felt it. A tiny crack. A seam that wasn't part of the grain. His heart hammered in his chest. Using his thumbnail, he pried at the seam. The base of the bird popped open. It was hollow. And inside, folded into a tiny, tight square, was a piece of paper. It was a deed. A deed to 100 acres of prime bottomland signed over to Lillian Wade by their father years ago. Land that Virgil Cross thought he had married into, Land that was now legally, rightfully theirs. Nora Jane's and Elsie May's. This was the secret, the inheritance, the reason Virgil was so desperate. And Harlan was holding the proof. He's not just cruel, Maggie breathed, her eyes wide with shock. He's a thief. The cabin was silent for a long moment. Then, from outside, came the sound of a horse whinnying, followed by a man's sharp curse. Harlan strode to the window and peered out into the darkness. 3 figures on horseback were coming up the path. It was the sheriff, and with him, grinning like a predator, was Virgil Cross. They hadn't waited for morning. The knock on the door this time was loud and official, a heavy fist hammering against the wood. "Harlan Wade, open up. This is Sheriff Brody." Harlan slipped the deed into his pocket. He looked at Maggie. Her face was pale but resolute. He looked at the girls, who had scrambled behind Maggie's skirts, their eyes huge with terror. "It's all right," he said, his voice a low growl. "Nobody's taking you anywhere." He opened the door. Sheriff Brody was a big man, but he looked small next to Harlan. His face was weathered and unhappy. He clearly didn't want to be here. Behind him, Virgil Cross sat on his horse, a smug, ugly look on his face. He had a length of rope coiled over his saddle horn. "Wade," the sheriff said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Virgil here says you're holding his girls against their will." "They came to me for shelter," Harlan said, his voice flat. "He threw them out in a blizzard." "That's a lie," Virgil snarled from his horse. "They run off. Ungrateful little things. I'm their legal guardian, Sheriff. The law says they belong with me." "Is that right, girls?" the sheriff asked, peering past Harlan into the cabin. "Do you want to go with Mr. Cross?" Elsie May started to sob, a choked, terrified sound. Nora Jane stepped forward. She stood beside Harlan, her small hand gripping his pant leg. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We want to stay here. With our uncle." The word hung in the cold night air. Uncle. The sheriff's eyes widened. Virgil's smug look vanished, replaced by pure fury. "Uncle?" the sheriff asked, looking from Harlan to Nora Jane. "What is she talking about, Wade?" "Their mother, Lillian, was my sister," Harlan said, his voice like rocks grinding together. "These are my nieces." "He's lying," Virgil shrieked, dismounting from his horse. "He's trying to steal my property, my land." He'd said it. The truth had slipped out in his rage. "Your land?" Harlan said, a cold, dangerous smile touching his lips. He pulled the folded deed from his pocket. "You mean this land? The land my father left to my sister? The land that now belongs to her daughters?" He held it up. The sheriff took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the paper. Virgil lunged for it, his face a mask of greed. "That's mine." Harlan didn't move. He just raised his other hand and caught Virgil by the throat. He lifted the smaller man clean off the ground, Virgil's feet kicking uselessly in the air. "You are a thief and a coward," Harlan said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You abused my sister's children. You left them to die. The law may be on your side, Sheriff," he said, looking at Brody, "but God is not." He threw Virgil to the ground. The man landed in a heap, gasping and choking in the snow. Sheriff Brody looked from the deed in Harlan's hand to the terrified girls in the doorway to the sputtering man on the ground. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man with eyes. He could see the truth standing right in front of him. "Virgil," the sheriff said, his voice hard as iron. "Your guardianship is looking mighty questionable right now. Assault, endangerment of a minor. And it looks like fraud, too." Virgil scrambled to his feet, his face purple with rage. "You can't prove any of that. It's his word against mine. The monster of the ridge. Who are you going to believe?" He was right. It was still a standoff. Harlan had the deed, but Virgil had the law, twisted as it was. One word from the sheriff, and the girls could still be torn away. The air was electric. Harlan could feel Nora Jane trembling beside him. He braced himself for the next move. But the next voice didn't come from the sheriff or from Virgil. It came from inside the cabin. "I can prove it," said Maggie Hayes, stepping into the doorway. The lantern light framed her, making her look like an avenging angel. She was holding a small, leather-bound book. "Lillian gave this to me, for safekeeping," Maggie said, her voice ringing out in the night. "She said if anything ever happened to her, I was to give it to the law." She held it out to the sheriff. "It's her journal." Sheriff Brody took the journal from Maggie's hand. He opened it, his face grim in the lantern light. Virgil Cross went absolutely still, the color drained from his face. He looked like a cornered animal. The sheriff read for a long time. The only sounds were the wind in the pines and Elsie Mae's muffled sobs. Finally, he looked up. But he wasn't looking at Harlan. He was looking at Virgil Cross, and his eyes were chips of ice. "It's all in here, Virgil," the sheriff said, his voice quiet but carrying a terrible weight. "The threats, the beatings, how you withheld food, how you tried to force her to sign over the deed." He flipped a few more pages. "And it's all in here about how she got sick. The tonics you insisted she take, the ones that made her weaker and weaker." The sheriff's hand tightened on the journal. "This isn't just a guardianship dispute anymore," he said. "This is a murder investigation." Virgil didn't say a word. He just turned and ran. He scrambled for his horse, a wild, panicked desperation in his eyes. Harlan started to move, but the sheriff put a hand on his arm. "Let him go." "Let him go?" Harlan roared. "After everything he's done?" "He won't get far," the sheriff said calmly, watching Virgil disappear into the darkness. "There's only one road out of this valley. I'll have a posse waiting for him at the pass by sunrise. He's trapped." The sheriff turned back to Harlan. He looked at the girls, then at Maggie, then at the massive, scarred man who had just had his entire world turned upside down. He handed the deed back to Harlan. "Looks like you have a family to take care of, Wade," he said. There was a new respect in his voice. "The law won't be bothering you again." He tipped his hat, turned, and rode off into the night, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Harlan stood there in the doorway, the cold air on his face, the deed in his hand. It was over. The fight was won. He turned and looked back into the cabin. The fire was burning bright. Maggie was kneeling, her arms around both girls, murmuring to them softly. Nora Jane looked up at him, her old, serious eyes shining with unshed tears. "Is it true?" she whispered. "Are you really our uncle?" He couldn't speak. He just knelt down, a difficult, creaking motion for a man his size, and for the first time he pulled his nieces into his arms. He held them tight, the two small, warm bodies against his chest. He could feel their hearts beating. He buried his face in their hair and breathed in the scent of wood smoke and innocence. Something inside him that had been frozen for 10 years finally began to thaw. He was not a monster. He was not a rock. He was a man, a brother, an uncle. And for the first time since the fire, Harlan Wade was not alone. He was home. The days that followed were strange and new. The silence of the cabin was replaced by the sound of children's laughter. The bare corners were filled with small things, a pile of interesting rocks, a doll Maggie made from scraps of cloth, the 2 pairs of fleece-lined boots set neatly by the door. Harlan learned to move differently in his own home. He learned to step over toys and to make his voice softer. He learned how to braid Elsie Mae's hair, his huge, clumsy fingers slowly becoming more nimble. He learned how to listen as Nora Jane read to him from the old Bible, her voice growing stronger and more confident each day. The town changed too. When Harlan drove the wagon down the main street now, people didn't stare with suspicion. They nodded. Some even smiled. The story of what happened that night had spread like wildfire. The story of the journal, of the deed, of Virgil Cross being caught at the pass, just as the sheriff had promised. Harlan was no longer the monster of the ridge. He was the man who had saved the Wade girls. Maggie Hayes became a constant presence. She would walk over from her own cabin, bringing fresh-baked bread or a pot of stew. She sat with the girls, teaching them to sew. She sat with Harlan by the fire, talking quietly about the past, about Lillian, about the future. She looked at his scar, but she didn't flinch. She saw the man, not the mark. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow, Harlan was sitting on the porch, watching the girls build a snow fort. Maggie came and sat beside him. "You're a good man, Harlan Wade," she said softly. "I'm not," he said, his voice rough. "For 10 years, I was a coward. I hid from the world because I was afraid." "You weren't hiding," Maggie said, her eyes fixed on his. "You were waiting. You just didn't know what you were waiting for." He looked at Nora Jane and Elsie Mae, their faces bright with joy as they threw snowballs at each other. Their laughter echoed in the crisp evening air. He thought of the knock that had changed his life, the two small ghosts who had appeared in the storm and brought him back into the world of the living. They weren't burdens, they were a blessing. They hadn't just found a home, they had built one, right here on this lonely ridge. They had taken his fortress of solitude and filled it with light and warmth and love. He reached out and took Maggie's hand. His rough, calloused fingers wrapped around hers. It felt right. The long winter was finally ending. Spring was coming. And for Harlan Wade, it felt like the first spring of his entire life. What do you think of Harlan's journey from recluse to protector? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice and redemption. Thanks for watching.